Hi everyone, welcome to our 13th PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction to PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK which specializes in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. PTRC is part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, which is the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April 2020, we've had some great conversations during these fireside chats, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we chat about today. I'll hand over to Glenn, who will be your chair for this discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Brogan. And yes, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PTRC Fireside Chat series. And as Brogan says, our latest event, number 13. So hopefully that will bring us good luck. My name's Glenn Lyons, and I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UWE Bristol in the UK. Really hope you enjoyed today's session, and thank you for joining us. And please be sure to get involved during the event by using the chat bar to raise issues and questions. Well, as you can see, you find me on the bridge of the Star Trek Enterprise. Why? Well, because for many transport planners, myself included, journeying into deep space of freight is one of the final frontiers. It can be a far-off world which seems unfamiliar, even alien. Now, I might be overdoing the Star Trek theme by suggesting that we will be boldly going where no man or woman has gone before. But this fireside chat is indeed an opportunity, both for those who inhabit this far-off galaxy, as well as for those of us who are new to exploring it, to learn more about its importance to our way of life, to the economy, and indeed to climate change. Thankfully, we have a highly skilled crew for this voyage. But before we beam them down, I'd just like to offer some further opening remarks to set the scene. As Brogan's mentioned, PTRC is part of CILT, an organisation which is no stranger, of course, to the two worlds of freight and logistics on the one hand and transport planning on the other. But I wonder how many other transport planners like me often catch themselves fixating on the movement of people and the activities giving rise to travel demand, only to realise late in the day that we've neglected to think also about movement of goods and the implications that has for our transport system, but also for the built environment and for placemaking. As we noted in the promotional text for this event, if you don't work in the freight and logistics industry, it's easy for goods movement and the industry itself to be largely invisible, unless you're stuck behind a slow-moving lorry or struggling to get past a delivery van parked on the pavement, or out for an early morning walk in the city centre, listening to a chorus of beeps and warning this vehicle is reversing. Goods appear as if by magic on the supermarket shelves, through our letterboxes and under Christmas trees. They could, of course, have travelled thousands of miles on different modes through checkpoints, and they will have involved handlers, HGV drivers, and last-mile delivery drivers. Even drones don't magic away the socio-technical complexities of supply chains. I was reading a Guardian article this morning from earlier this year. It was called The Hidden Life of a Lorry Driver. Long shifts, absent from their families, an ageing male workforce, driver shortage, shortage of staff to unload cargoes, endless waiting, little public sympathy concerning vehicle parking and physical and mental health issues. I must just share with you this shocking story of a driver disturbed in his sleep on his lorry as the cargo on his curtain-sided trailer is being stolen. He pulled back the curtain on the passenger side of the cab. A man was standing there. He put one finger on his lips and slid another across his throat. 10 accomplices unloaded the van. Piper called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. Afterwards, a doctor signed him off work for a week and prescribed him anti-anxiety medication. A more sobering insight there into what the magic can really involve. Moving from the front line to academia, goods movement can often still appear the poor relation to people movement. Within the world of transport studies, I can point to innumerable academic colleagues involved with passenger transport, but almost count on a hand or two the go-to experts I'm aware of who specialise in goods movement. Now, perhaps it's just that I inhabit a different network. And in fact, communities of academic research into freight and logistics are alive, well, and thriving. And I know Andrew's just got back from one such community over in Cork, so he may have more to say on that. Nevertheless, what this might suggest is that the professional networks are not interacting enough, and at what cost, we might ask, to how our transport system's evolving and is used. This is pertinent to the new guidance for local transport plans in England, currently being developed by the Department for Transport. Such plans will continue to shape and hopefully decarbonise our urban areas in uncertain times, and goods movement is surely integral to that. In Europe, guidance exists for developing SUMPs, Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. These are strategic plans in which goods movement can seem a peripheral consideration, if a consideration at all. Meanwhile, more operational SULPs, Sustainable Urban Logistics Plans, are a separate undertaking. The UK government, almost a month ago to the day, published a new white paper, its Future of Freight Plan. The vision is described as follows: a freight and logistics sector that is cost efficient, reliable, resilient, environmentally sustainable, and valued by society. Such a vision statement begs the question of how far away from that description does it feel we are today? Well, it certainly seems apparent that the freight and logistics industry is subject to some powerful dynamics of change. I'll just read an extract from the white paper, if I may. The sector is emerging from the operational challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic and the transition to a new relationship with the EU, whilst managing the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war and longer-term implications for the global free trade system. As well as managing the issues of today, it must also look to the future and to meeting the opportunities and challenges of the transition to net zero, ensuring it has the right skills and people, changing consumer trends and new technology. The white paper goes on to note, a disconnect exists between industry that is not equipped to properly engage with planning processes and local planning authorities that are unable to understand the needs of a changing and innovative freight and logistics sector. Raising the status of freight is a key concern of this government plan as well. And yet the document concedes that there is limited understanding on the future skills mix and what government needs to do to support industry to address future skills gaps. So, with that new white paper helping set the scene, how much of a challenge lies ahead for freight? Is it really the Cinderella of the transport system? And what could and should change to offer a positive outlook for the future after the multiple shocks the industry has been navigating? Well, I'm very much hoping our panel can offer some answers on all of this. So without further ado, let's hear opening remarks from each of them. Maggie, over to you.
Glenn, thank you very much. A great introduction and what I hope is going to be a really interesting session, and looking very much forward to hearing what my fellow panelists think from their perspective as we go through the next 90 minutes or so. Let me just introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm Maggie Simpson. I'm the Director General of the Rail Freight Group. We are a member-led trade association representing businesses in the rail freight sector. That's everyone from train operators through to end customers, ports, terminals, supply chain and support services. And our ambition as an organisation is to help rail freight grow because we know that that delivers economic and environmental benefits for the UK. And indeed other countries, although we are UK only, those ambitions I know are shared certainly across the EU and indeed around the globe. So obviously my speciality is rail freight, but the points that Glenn makes about how freight is viewed and managed within local and regional government, within transport planning, I think is pretty common. And amongst colleagues who are, cross-modal, we've talked for many years about being that Cinderella sector, or the phrase that often gets used is freight blindness, i.e. people just don't see freight. But as Glenn said, that's actually been something that we've seen that's changed a little bit with COVID and Brexit, bringing freight much more to the forefront in terms certainly of the media and in people's perceptions. But why is it that freight's been overlooked for such a long time? And for me, there are a lot of reasons behind that. Firstly, generally speaking, it works. It was until Brexit, COVID, pretty unusual to go to the shops and find you couldn't get what you wanted. Deliveries tend to arrive when you expect them, more or less. And generally speaking, freight and logistics supply chains have kept factories and manufacturing sites fed at the pace that they want and at a cost that they've wanted generally. Freight is often very far removed from our personal experience. We all go out, whether on foot or on bus or in our cars, and make personal trips. We rarely move freight. Rail freight and logistics play out at a global or a national level. So it's very hard to compartmentalise them down into those local chunks, which transport planning is often done at, because a supply chain that ends in a particular town or village may well have started on the other side of the globe. Freight doesn't vote. So as passengers, we all vote, or many of us vote, freight doesn't. And the revenues and costs that come to and from freight distribution don't accrue to the public purse, either in a positive or indeed a negative way. And so inevitably people focus on those modes where they either get the return or are responsible for the bottom line. It's not controlled in the same way that passenger transport is. Many local bodies can specify a bus network or a parking charge, but they can't specify freight. And so it leaves people with this illusion of freight that it's just too difficult, or it's too remote, or it's something that they shouldn't participate in or don't need to. As I've said, we've seen that renewed focus coming forward, and that's been a really good thing. I think the DFT document that Glenn referred to is an example of that increasing awareness. But even so, it's only really a partial step forward. I think it's still been very focused on failures. People are talking about freight now because it went wrong. We couldn't get toilet rolls or we couldn't get petrol. It hasn't really picked up the sort of economic importance of having a well-functioning supply chain. It's very much only a partial picture. We've all begun to understand that freight is what's bringing our Amazon parcel to our door or our Tesco delivery, but we're still all pretty blind to the movement of steel behind the scenes or the aggregates that are filling in the potholes. We're very much focused on the urban networks, and I know we'll hear a lot more about that today, and I'm sure Claire will tell us about the excellent work that they've been doing looking at urban distribution. But actually urban distribution is the end of a long supply chain, and people aren't really looking at how we engage with the other parts of that supply chain and the inevitable linkages between urban and national. And as though we're all beginning to raise our awareness, I think there's still a very long way to go to actually getting people confident in understanding freight and how they engage with it and what those key issues are. And so events today, like today's, are really welcome in helping to bring a bit more openness and a bit more awareness to that. So thank you very much, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
That's a splendid start for us, Maggie. Thanks very much. And I just want to pick up on what a couple of the things you said, which perhaps tie together, really struck me. It works was one of your remarks, and also freight doesn't vote. And I'm thinking, you know, an event like this, we hopefully glide gracefully like swans across the surface of the water, but you know, feet are going like mad underneath to make it work until it goes wrong. And then if you're not well equipped and well skilled, things start to crumble, and then perhaps freight does get a vote because those supermarket shelves are empty, medicines aren't delivered, and people start to feel quite strongly about that when it's not working. So I just wondered very briefly if you wanted to come back on that, whether you think there is a heightened risk now that it might be more fragile and then voting might matter. So
I think what we're certainly seeing is, I suppose it's a bit like wobbling a jelly, isn't it? You can wobble it and wobble it and wobble it, and generally speaking, it wobbles and bounces back. But if you shake the plate enough, you end up with an unholy mess. And I think what we saw pretty much through Brexit and COVID was that jelly reaching, you know, quite a degree of wobble, but I didn't see an unholy mess landing on the floor. So the supply chains are very resilient, and you know, using your swan-like analogy, people have worked very hard to make sure that they have delivered with very little disruption in the end. So I would like to think that people still retain a high level of confidence in those supply chains, and that, you know, it doesn't become an electoral challenge. Equally, we can't be assured of that because, you know, the global situation is still pretty fragile, actually.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. I love the jelly analogy. I'm used to trying to nail jelly to the wall, but I rather like the idea that it's more flexible and adaptive in the way you described it. Great, let's move to Andrew.
Okay, thanks very much, Glenn, and also Maggie for a great start. I'm Professor Andrew Potter. I'm a Professor in Transport and Logistics at Cardiff University. I've been doing research in the field for probably 20 years or so now, looking not just at firm level, but across supply chains, and increasingly thinking about how that interacts at a policy level as well, and how we can sort of take the learnings from a firm and think about the influences that might have on transport policy. So over that time, you pick up quite a lot. And like I say, Maggie's highlighted a number of issues, particularly around freight blindness. But I think it's important to perhaps start about, well, why is freight important? And we've talked a lot already about the goods that go to your shelf and how they get there, and obviously the supply chains that go behind that. But it's worth keeping in mind as well that freight is more than just things that we buy. Freight services the restaurants we eat at, the cinemas we might go to, and also services the hospitals and medical facilities we use as well. So freight comes in a wide variety of things, and equally things like waste collection are effectively another form of freight movement too. So there's lots of different varieties of freight and lots of different ways in which it operates, and it's important to think of it in that broader sense. And it's a sector and that very much, I think, is keen to build on things like sustainability and resilience that we've talked about. As Glenn said, I've been at a conference the past few days, and the two biggest themes that kept coming up were around how we make supply chains more resilient and how we make them more sustainable. And whilst there's a lot that firms can do within their own operations to achieve that, they are ultimately reliant upon the infrastructure and the transport network as a key element of the supply chain. And so there is that interface between what the firm does and what we provide as transport infrastructure. So given that context, I think, as we've said, it's important, but policy does often overlook freight itself. And that freight blindness then often leads to tensions. I think you probably, if you look in the media, there's quite often a slanging match between different bodies when it comes to, for instance, reallocating road space. That's not helpful for anyone's perspective, isn't it? It just creates tension. It creates arguments that are focused on very small issues rather than taking that bigger picture as to what's the best for that particular location. And so it's important to try and get everyone on board, and everyone needs to make some changes and think about how they work together. I think quite often the industry feels that it's perhaps not being listened to, but it's being asked to make changes, and it's not necessarily a two-way street. And so if we can get everything working together, hopefully that will lead to better outcomes overall. I think we are seeing changes. We've mentioned the Future of Freight document already, and there's a number of regional freight strategies come around as well, and Scotland's got one. Wales will hopefully have one in a couple of years' time too. So there is that movement towards these regional strategies which give a bit more of a local focus. But there is this question as to whether we need to have a freight strategy separate from a transport strategy, or whether the two should be integrated. I don't have an answer to that one way or the other, because I think there are some issues where there is obviously an overlap. So for instance, if you take rail, the shared infrastructure between passenger and freight trains, but equally there are issues that are unique to the sector as well, for instance, around working hours and working conditions that perhaps require that separate document. I think also with regional policy documents, it's worth keeping in mind that actually the key decision makers may not be located in the regions where the policies are being created, because of the UK-wide and global supply chains we have nowadays. And that does create a challenge for policymakers on those regions in how they actually bring that change about if they haven't got buy-in from, say, local representatives of these UK-wide firms. Now, over the past few months, I've been doing quite a bit looking at infrastructure appraisal and the processes that go through there. And I think that's perhaps where we see the biggest disconnect between sort of the policy aspirations of planning and actually the delivery of schemes. I've looked at a number of different documents, and it's quite often the case that freight barely gets a mention. So if you're building a road, all you get is the traffic flow for trucks, and maybe a phrase that says this is a major freight corridor. But there's no detail as to, well, why is it a major freight corridor, unless it's patently obvious, and no real understanding as to where the freight is going from and to, and what needs is it servicing. I think getting that understanding will help make better planning and better decisions as a result. And through that, thinking about why this happens, I think there's things around, obviously we've talked about lack of awareness already. But there's also things like lack of data, that obviously with the freight sector being more in the private sector, having detailed data is often more difficult to obtain. We get very generalized UK-wide or regional-based data, which is often even larger than the scheme that you might be looking to implement. And I think sometimes, particularly with road, there's also a case of what's good for cars must be good for trucks as well, without necessarily thinking about if that is really the case. You probably see it as well with rail to some extent. I know Maggie will no doubt fill that in more, but for instance, electrification. We always talk about electrification for passenger trains, but there's lots of little bits of electrification that can make a big difference to freight movements. And I suppose I'll conclude by really, what does freight want from a transport network? Now, like I say, this is more couched for road than perhaps than rail. But I think there's sort of three key things that come through. One is reliable journey times. So being able to guarantee that a vehicle will arrive at the time that's expected. So congestion is obviously the biggest issue there. But that doesn't necessarily mean build more roads. It might mean get more cars off the road so that other vehicles can arrive on time. I think there's also around safe road layouts. We hear a lot about, particularly in urban areas, the tension between large vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists. Now, that's not to say that their drivers aren't necessarily causing all the problems, but perhaps we need to think whether sometimes the layouts are suitable to allow the two to mix in a safe way, and are there things we could do to make that better? And then finally, again, perhaps more from a roads perspective, and it comes back to what you said, Glenn, safe and secure places for drivers to park up, and not just in urban areas, but particularly in rural areas where perhaps you are away from the main trunk road network, and maybe drivers do have to rely on muddy lay-bys at the side of fairly narrow roads in remote locations. How can we develop schemes that not only improve infrastructure for everyone, but also build in perhaps enhanced facilities for drivers, not just lay-bys, but things like toilets, refreshments and things like that, so that they get a better break. It would then improve safety on the roads because they won't necessarily be so tired. And it will also potentially help address issues around retention of workforce as well, because working conditions will be improved. So I think that's it for me as an opening statement.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. And I'm sat listening, obviously following on from Maggie as well, almost feeling guilty that we have another event just titled Freight, when the heterogeneity of the industry is just so extensive. And of course, we know that's the case with movement of people. We have had sessions on walking as a distinct mode because there's so much to talk about just in walking. And in fact, of course, we could have a whole session on cargo bikes and the intricacies around the challenges and opportunities that presents. So one starts to feel and appreciate very quickly how frustrating it is when perhaps the connections between this part of the transport sector and other parts of the transport and planning processes are maybe fragile, and as to whose fault it is that the listening and talking isn't happening to the degree it might be something we come back to. The one thing I wanted to pick up as a specific follow-on question to you, you mentioned resilience and reliable journey times, and Lindsay Oxlade in the audience had asked, does the experience of the pandemic supply chain disruption spell the end of just-in-time logistics? So, anything you can offer perhaps in terms of any moving back to warehousing as something that can offset the just-in-time reliance to be as lean and mean as possible?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily spells the end of just-in-time. I think it probably spells a rethinking of just-in-time. I think just-in-time has been extended not just to say local supply chains around the factory, but to global supply chains. And we've lost some of that resilience in terms of having perhaps manufacturers closer to where consumers are, and like I say, stock holding. I think there's still a role for just in time, but it might be just in almost time rather than just in time. I think firms will still try to get things through as smoothly as possible, because to some extent there'll be more significant infrastructure changes within their own operations to completely cast away with it straight away. But things like reshoring, having stock more local to where it's needed, I think will start to change that. So I think there's a rethinking of just in time as a result.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Let's move on to Daniela. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you very much. So what I would like to do, I will start with doing a brief introduction of myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm Daniela Padeo. I'm a senior researcher at the University West of England at the Centre for Transport and Society in Bristol, UK. And I am the freight specialist of the research centre. So I am basically the only person working on freight in my research centre. And I mainly work on sustainable and innovative solutions for freight with focus on last mile deliveries, mainly on urban deliveries than rural deliveries. And I look at decarbonization strategies, plans, and policies to just make last mile deliveries more sustainable. I would like to link back to something that Glenn lightly touched earlier about transport planning. So I think transport planning and policy as usually prioritized measures and interventions targeting the movement of people over the mobility of goods. And I've never understood why, actually, as freight transport accounts for 1/3 of the overall carbon emissions from the transport sector, with road freight playing a major role because most of the freight is moved by large trucks and vans, especially in the UK. There's been a recognition very recently in the UK decarbonization strategy, transport decarbonization plan, which encourages the implementation of specific tailored measures and interventions to reduce carbon emissions from freight. However, these interventions mainly include cleaner fuels and propulsion like hydrogen or electrification, mainly for long distance road freight, and some operational solutions for local deliveries, such as compulsory consolidation centers, for example, and e-cargo bikes. And I have to say that the plan does not provide a clear direction to local authorities to actually design and implement measures to address the big issue of freight transport and last mile deliveries. So there are mainly general directions with no clear detail about what local governments should do and how much power they have to implement these solutions. I've also recently delivered a project for the Local Government Association where I engaged a big number of local authorities and councillors from all over England. And I've discovered that local authorities are a bit lost when we discuss freight issues and potential solutions to reduce the externalities produced by freight movements. Actually, most councils feel they don't have enough capacity or capabilities to fully understand what to do to address local freight issues and also how they can align with national thinking. So we can say that freight is a very new issue in the local transport agenda, and the stronger local authorities feel like they need a stronger steer and support from central government to really understand what the options are, but also who owns the power at the moment they need to implement something, they need to take actions, such as, for example, pricing schemes or large-scale use of e-cargo bikes or compulsory consolidation centers. All of these solutions might actually require a change in regulations and funding. So there is a need to a bigger and stronger integration between local and central governments. And I know Andrew said it's not just about the products we buy, but I also have to say that the UK is the third largest market for online shopping and home deliveries in the world, just after the US and China, the first in Europe. So we shouldn't be surprised if there is quite a lot of local concern and urgent need to find effective solutions to address the issues related to the delivery of the products we buy. The main point is that consumers buy much more than they need, and 25% of products are actually returned for free for customers. So this is what they perceive, but not for society, because this has actually generated an increase in the volume of van movements. We had an increase of over 100% in the last 25 years of miles traveled by vans, and numbers are expected to significantly grow in the future. So I believe that when we look at freight, it's not just about how we make freight movements more efficient or sustainable, but also how can we reduce the volumes of these movements, not only looking at how can we consolidate freight and optimize the loads, but also how can we reduce the need for these movements, so how can we reduce consumption. And I have to say that in respect to this issue, the role of end consumer is incredibly important, and I'm therefore very surprised that behavior change, sustainable consumerism, communication and education are not at all mentioned in the decarbonization strategy or in the Freight Future paper when it comes to find solutions to freight. I really like something that Maggie earlier said, that you picked as well, Glenn. There was freight does not vote. So I wonder, is this the reason why end consumers are not brought into consideration when we want to look at specific measures to drive behavior change, such as, for example, pricing measures or penalization on very unsustainable same day, next day deliveries? I believe there is a strong need to really understand, to have a more holistic perspective, system thinking approach to understand how supply and demand interact, but also how all the other apparently external factor systems or factors to the main freight system, what kind of impact everything has on the overall freight system. And I think if we consider not only trade movements from I think everyone, when we hear about freight, non-expert people, we imagine shipping or big trucks, but it is actually, we should actually look at the smaller things as well as the bigger things. So we should look at the details and smaller components of the system to really understand more in depth the bigger picture of freight. Yeah, and thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to hear more about the other experts as well.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Daniela. I'm sitting listening to each of you thinking, right, I must cherry pick some important things I can come back on. And I'm scribbling more and more and frustrated more and more with my short-term memory, because there are, I mean, what you've just wonderfully illustrated on top of the previous two sets of remarks is just, again, the diversity and the enormity really of the challenge if we want change to happen. I think you've probably got a fan in the audience, and I hope John Carr won't mind me replaying his critical commentary on the future of freight plan, which he refers to as perhaps being more motherhood and apple pie. Lots of aspiration. You know, here's the nature of the problem. Yes, we must do more, mustn't we? And you, Daniela, have picked up on the transport decarbonisation plan and the sense that it's touching upon the surface of this and flagging things that must happen or it would like to see happen, but not really giving a strong enough steer to local authorities. And it does worry me. And Maggie Herity in the audience has asked or really made the point that, you know, we spend so much time fixating on a myriad of other issues that relate to passenger transport. And why isn't freight in the conversation, in the political discourses in urban areas when plans are being developed? And it really does seem quite worrying to me that we are on the cusp of having new local transport planning guidance with an expectation that around England, local authorities will be developing new local transport plans. Coming back to your work that you've done for the LGA, do you sense a real concern that without the direction from central government, the capacity is lacking in local authorities to really be able to get to grips with these things?
So thank you for the question, first of all. I've noticed that local transport plan, so there is a section in the Freight Future paper that is about planning. And within that section, there is something about local transport planning. So actually DFT recognized that freight is important and it should be included in the next local transport planning guidance. However, again, considering the couple of projects I delivered recently engaging with local authorities, I'm very concerned of, I feel sorry for them, to be honest, if I have to be honest, because they have no experience, not a really in-depth understanding of what the freight issue is. So I'm just a bit concerned that they are asked to do something they don't fully understand or they are not prepared to manage, even though I have to say that they recognize, in my experience I had with the projects, I found that they recognize the problem, they know there is an issue, they are desperate to find support from central government to really design specific measures, effective measures to solve the issue. But despite the very high level information and directions from central government, I think there would be a stronger need for more in-depth, more detailed directions from central government to local governments, because otherwise it's going to be just central government saying, yes, we have an issue, yes, you have to solve it, but how can they actually solve it if they don't fully understand how to do it? Or if they don't have capacity to do it, because it's also a lack of resources, not just a lack of understanding and knowledge.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Daniela. And I mean, just as you've been working for the LGA, we've got the benefit of having Claire in a few minutes' time, hearing from the urban transport group perspective, and again, the importance of a coalition of authorities and shared voices and perhaps shared resources. Maybe that's the key to tackling some of this, rather than just seeing it as an unaddressed problem. Right, thank you for that. Mike, let's come to you, please.
Hi, Glenn. Well, thank you very much, and good to take part in this fireside chat, although I must admit, I guess we're all in different places and we all have different temperatures going on, but I think the last thing I'd need at the moment would be a fireside, because where I am, it's about 35 degrees centigrade, I think. And I have to say, I was so concentrating on this that when we were all online a few minutes before, I just thought, Glenn doesn't normally dress like that, but well, you know, what's going on here? And it was only when you started with the discussion that I picked up on it. So I think I was a bit slow, which I'll put down to the heat and over too much Zoom effect. So just a couple of remarks and then some points as everybody else has done, because it's been really great to hear those comments from different perspectives, but with kind of like a Venn diagram, good overlaps between the different areas. So I work in the University of Gothenburg, where I've been there since 2015. But before then, I worked at the University of Westminster in London for over 25 years. And my focus over the last 10 years or so has been really very much on urban freight transport questions. But I've obviously, as anybody has who's been working a long time in a field, I've worked on a lot of other studies as well about shipping and about a little bit about intermodal transport, about long distance road freight, about the effect of market deregulation, and about the sort of nature of operations in the industry. So I'm really interested in the sort of wider picture, and I'm very interested in how we can connect better even within the area of freight, because I completely agree with Maggie that we are inclined to talk about the urban area as if it can exist without the periphery of the urban area, the peri-urban area, and can exist somehow without the regional setting, let alone the long distance supply chains, which of course, in terms of cities that are gateways, are clearly a key function that the city has. So I think we really do have to see that joined up. And I take your challenge at the beginning seriously, that we need to think about how can we better integrate the freight discussion with the personal travel mobility discussion, because I think we have to do that, because in many cases they are related, and we'll come on to that with lots of examples. I know about how if you reduce if you're going to do without a car or use a car in a different way, you need more, probably will maybe expect more home deliveries and so on. So I think there are lots of areas where we can think about these things in a joined up way. And I've known you quite a while, Glenn, and I'm just happy that you've discovered freight. I mean, it's not a terrible thing that you've missed it for a while. Now we need to get your good ideas involved in it and make these bridges between the different areas. So I think there's room for some optimism. On the other hand, it's also naive to say that there aren't big problems that need to be overcome, I think. So in terms of that, I mean, I'm speaking mainly obviously from an academic perspective, but since 2006, I've chaired the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, which brings together the boroughs in Central London, but also some of the other boroughs as well, Transport for London, and then industry, represented by trade associations like the Freight Transport Association. I know it's not called that anymore, but Freight Transport Association, and institutes like the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, and then transport operators like DHL and UPS and others, many others, and their customers. And I think that's been really for me a great learning experience. I hope I've contributed something to the nature of the way that we've been able to discuss things, but I guess I've learned just more than I've been able to give to the partnership in that sense, because hearing people talk about their day-to-day challenges, the problems they face from different perspectives is very eye-opening, and small successes are small, but I think they're very important steps. So when I see people communicating so much better between a borough level and a discussion from a transport operator perspective, then I feel heartened by that. And it makes me think that's okay, but it's taken a long time, and we need to find ways to speed it up, and we need to find ways to multiply it up. And I pick up on Daniela's comment about sharing things between different kind of organizations and different levels that we're all working at. So for me, this sort of nature of partnership is important, and I think about that quite a lot when I think about freight transport in particular, regardless of scale, but in the urban context, it's certainly very important. And I think you touched on the question of heterogeneity, and this is really a critical thing, because it's very difficult sometimes to have a good discussion about something when you put everything together and say, well, it's just freight. But on the other hand, if we make it too disaggregate, it becomes very specialist, and people start to tune out because they're saying, why do I need to know about how many kilos fit into this? Or what's the payload capacity of a cargo bike? And what do they mean it volumes out? And this sort of discussion going on. But that's also related to the data, because sometimes we're talking about things in terms of number of trips. Sometimes we talk about them in terms of the volume. Sometimes we talk about the weight and the volume. Other times we talk about are we talking about the cargo or the freight itself, or are we talking about the vehicles? Sometimes these are not always the clearest of discussions, I would say. And it's not surprising, because freight is such a complex mix of activities going across all kinds of different distances, and particularly different spaces. So when we think about how space works and how spatial planning works, of course freight's difficult to deal with because of this variety, this factor of so many different varieties. And in terms of space, I think a lot of times we focus really quite understandably, we focus on moving things. So transport is all about movement, and of course that means movement on the road network. But just think of the points already made in the discussion, and your comment about the driver needing a place to park, and Andrew picking up on that point. Stationary aspects of freight are also important. Who's using the curbside? We don't have enough curbside to just allow everybody to use it, so we make rules, but then still people use it and get a fine for doing that. So we have a lot of second best ways of dealing with some of these issues. But in terms of freight movement, I think the movements are critical, but the spatial aspect of it in terms of when it's stationary are also very important to understand and to address. And I suppose an area that I've worked in quite a lot with the Freight Partnership is around stakeholders. And this is a term that everybody uses, and it's become sort of almost a cliche word. And I worry sometimes if I say it, perhaps it's going to be misunderstood. But in terms of stakeholders, I think it's, of course, we have some very obvious ones here. We have already mentioned them, the different authorities at different levels and so on, and then the companies themselves who are involved. But I think there's a temptation sometimes in freight transport to focus on transport operators. And of course, they should receive a lot of attention. But the activities and the actions of other parties are also very important. So their customers, the people who receive the products, how they choose to do that is very significant. Daniela mentioned about people wanting goods delivered right to their home and so on, but also for companies. A lot of companies take freight transport and logistics very seriously, But in other cases, it's not so visible to some organisations. I remember doing some research in London looking at deliveries to offices, where in a big office building you might have 150 deliveries a day happening. And when you ask the people running the building how many deliveries they get, they go, oh, I don't know, they just come in at the back, I think. And occasionally they walk in at the front and try to use the lift, but we don't let them do that. We make sure they go in the freight lift. You know, they can't have them mixing with everybody else. And this seems, really trivial thing. But if you think, and we could fix some of the sort of problems by making all these deliveries electric. But if they're all electric and we have an inefficient receiving system, then they'll still be queued up back onto Baker Street. And this isn't a good solution. So thinking about the system is very important, I think. And that just applied to an urban example, but you'd find the same if you thought about ports, if you thought about rail terminals. Any part of the freight system is connected to other things which are to do with this logistics discussion. And I think I'd like to sort of come to the end of this part, but to say, well, it's definitely a system, and I think that's something that I know we will talk about more. And just to say that I think there's a kind of a difficult challenge about how we frame discussions here. And I thought about it when Maggie was speaking about how we only think about freight when it's a problem. And I thought, yeah, I'm inclined to do that a bit. I sort of pick on problems and then I say, oh, more research needed here. But then perhaps that's because I'm a researcher. But anyway, we focus perhaps on the problems. But I think, yeah, we do that. But on the other hand, we have a lot of things where research is about best practice. And that's almost like the opposite end of it. You sort of have this example of best practice and you simply say, but if more people did this best practice, well, it would all be fixed, wouldn't it? And of course, neither is quite true. But how we fit them more closely together is one of those sort of things that I think we won't fix it today. But the more we think about how to fix this, the problem of the problem of problems, if you like, and couching things in a negative sense, and on the other hand, wish lists and examples which can't very easily be transferred, that's a big challenge, I think, in terms of fixing the freight problem and stopping this jelly from wobbling too much, as Maggie said earlier on. Okay,
Great.
thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm going to repeat myself, but what you really reminded me is I jolly well got stuck into this about 15 or 20 years ago, then I wouldn't be so mind blown by all of the issues that I now realise we should be exploring in so much more detail. I want to join together some of the threads in what you said and also a couple of comments from the audience. You highlighted, of course, this issue of the lack of integration between thinking about movement of people and goods. You mentioned the curbside, which interestingly, Sharon Kindley-Sides, the new chief exec of CILT, very much holds dearly in terms of the future of the curbside as a contested space and a key part of the infrastructure, the system of bringing together people and goods movement. But Christopher, in the audience, Christopher Papiano, raises the issue about the relative neglect of EVs and EVs for goods movement and cargo bikes, and a sense that they're at the trial stage, but they're coming into the discourse, I think. But that seems to me a beautiful example of where we should really now be talking about shared infrastructure solutions which pick up people and goods using, in some senses, similar vehicles and designing the infrastructure with both in mind. So I don't know, do you have an optimism that perhaps the way things are evolving and the technological changes happening in the imperatives, that it's almost naturally forcing this coming together more of thinking about people and goods when we're planning the future, or not? Am I being too optimistic?
I think that's quite a hard question, actually, because I think that at the beginning you mentioned about sustainable urban mobility plans, which mention freight. And then you said, but we also have sustainable urban logistic plans, which are very focused. But hold on a minute, shouldn't these be joined together? And I think they are more and more joined together. But it can be difficult for people writing these plans at whatever level they're at. But at the city level, for example, it can be very difficult just getting enough to put in the sustainable urban logistics plan without tying it into a very complicated set of initiatives that are going on to do with personal mobility. So clearly, we have to deal with the problem together at some point because the space is shared and there's an allocation discussion and then there's a management discussion. But I mean, I think it's also wrong to focus just on, say, cargo bikes. I mean, cargo bikes need spaces from where they can operate, and so the planning system has to address that, and things like change of use of property has to be considered. And this then becomes a slightly more complicated problem. It's not enough just to have more cargo bikes. We need to have a setup that allows for them to be used in a good way. Otherwise, things that at the moment don't get noticed very much, like is it okay if they're on the pavement or not okay, will become sort of more of a problem in the future. So I think it's good that we think about moving beyond the trial stage, but let's do that in a sort of joined up way, in a coherent way.
I found myself yet again back in the 1980s thinking about Yes Minister. And surely what we need is an integrated transport strategy. And we could find a transport supremo, couldn't we? I mean, we've got this parade of leadership in front of us. Surely amongst them, there is a supremo who can integrate all this together and make life wonderful. I know it's not that easy. Maybe Claire's got the answers. Claire, over to you. Thanks for waiting.
Thanks very much, Glenn. I'm not sure I've got all the answers, but I'll try and give a bit of a perspective from the city regions. So just to introduce myself, my name's Claire Linton. I'm Policy and Research Advisor at the Urban Transport Group, which brings together the 7 largest city region transport authorities in England, including Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, that kind of scale of organisation. So we produced a report in January this year called Delivering a Greener Future, which took a look at kind of freight and logistics in our city regions. And this was a kind of re-update of a report we put out in 2015 looking at freight, because things have changed a lot over the last sort of few years with Brexit, the pandemic, and they've increased the focus on the climate crisis. So we thought it was kind of time to come back to freight and logistics and think about it in a new light. So just to kind of summarize our perspectives from that, we sort of split the idea of freight into different sections of the journey. So thinking about, like I say, we're a city region organisation, so we are focused on urban area, and I recognise that, that we've already addressed that that's not necessarily always the best focus, but we were thinking about things in terms of the journey to the urban area. So that's kind of the long bit of the journey that's probably taking place on the strategic road network or via rail. And then we were thinking about what happens when those goods arrive in our urban areas and how we can make sure they're distributed and consolidated in the most efficient ways when they arrive in our urban areas. And then we think about the last mile, so thinking about how we can make the last mile safer, greener, smarter, so applying sort of new technologies, and quieter. So that's kind of our perspective on freight, and our report covers lots of different interesting examples of how innovation's happening to make those things happen. But I mean, I've written loads of notes as everyone's kind of been introducing themselves, because there's so many interesting dimensions to the challenges and problems in freight. But some of the things that really struck me was this idea of partnership. So one of the things that we do at Urban Transport Group is bring together officers leading on freight in city regions, kind of share knowledge and best practice to try and support that. And I also think there's some really good examples of partnership between sort of local authorities and the freight sector. So Mike gave the example of London, but also in the Northeast. There's a really good example of freight partnership working there to kind of work together. And one of the things that struck me is this point around sumps and sulks, and whether there's different priorities between sort of transport planners and freight and logistics planners. And I was thinking that maybe what we need to think about is kind of what outcomes we want. So when trying to identify shared priorities. So I think we often think of like transport planners trying to deliver kind of passenger focused things and sustainable city regions, and the freight side trying to deliver kind of things in the most cost efficient ways. But actually, can we think about where the kind of shared priorities and outcomes are, and would that help us to move to kind of a more integrated approach? And kind of we're thinking about it in terms of like delivering greener, fairer, happier, healthier, and more prosperous places. And how would things look if we kind of switch to thinking about things from that perspective? And then the other kind of key reflection I had from what we've talked about so far was kind of the role of planning and local authorities. And I think absolutely kind of how we better integrate kind of logistics planning and wider transport planning, at a local authority level is critical to this. But they are operating in highly constrained environments with, a lack of revenue funding to kind of do the strategic planning. And we know we've got lots of really great people in our authorities, but they're really stretched and trying to do lots of different things and don't necessarily have the specific expertise in freight and logistics. And as I can't remember who said it, I think it was Daniela was saying that actually how you bring the freight and logistics into the transport planning process is really challenging when people don't necessarily have that background. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, but yeah, there's so much we can kind of get into over the next sort of 35 minutes. I'm excited to carry on the discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. And I think, the outcomes focus, I suppose we could all sign up to, but again, I find myself coming back. You mentioned the distinction between transport planners and freight logistics planners. And maybe it's inescapable that we are dealing with what feel like ever more complex systems, or indeed systems of systems. And one can zoom right out and say the transport sector, and one can zoom right into specific metrics that Mike was referring to in parts of the freight and logistics industry. Maybe that's just the nature of the beast, that it is complex and there aren't easy answers, of course. But I just wondered if you had any other thoughts about, you mentioned highly constrained local authorities. What's the sense you're getting from across the sort of UTG community? Are they up for the challenge and able to rise to it, or what are they looking for that they don't have?
I think they're all up for it from a sense of wanting to create more sustainable, prosperous places, and they recognise that freight and logistics is a key part of that. But they're all operating in an environment where they don't have a huge amount of revenue funding, and there's not loads of officers with the knowledge and experience and capacity and capability to really get into this and to really integrate it in a holistic way. So I think the desire is there, but and I think it doesn't help that we operate in an environment where a lot of funding is based on kind of ad hoc competition funding. So government will put out a competition funding for XYZ, and you've got to scramble to do that, and how that fits into kind of your more long-term strategic planning. You've just got to sometimes drop everything else so you can apply for this competition funding, which doesn't result in kind of that kind of long-term strategic vision. So yeah, I think the funding picture is challenging.
And we've just a reflection back on all of you, I suppose, in terms of various things you said. John Paddington's comment in the audience has just caught my eye. Receiving goods seems to be overlooked in urban design. Why aren't new houses designed to have parcel lockers, for instance? And I'm thinking, about, we've had a recent, Transport for New Homes criticism of carb-centric planning continuing. We've got criticism about new houses that don't have solar panels to tackle, their energy efficiency. John's point then, one adds to that, about goods storage and of course home working, recasting how we use our spaces, many of us. It does seem hugely frustrating that the connection with planning is failing on multiple fronts, not just perhaps with goods movement. But can I maybe open it up to all of you? There's an element, of course, of problematizing and needing to, as Mike has said, to be focused so much on the nature of the problem. Do you have notes of optimism, or indeed, what would be your kind of top wishes for things that can really help cut through and make strong progress in these difficult times? Put your hand up maybe if you're geared up to go first on that question, if it's made sense to you.
Just very quick comment actually about that, because it links to this question or comment in the chat about apparently about why aren't we designing homes for receiving parcels, and what about cargo bike spaces and so on, and storing them, a place where people can store them, because we've talked mainly about movement of freight, but of course a lot of trips on the network are about services, which is a complicated connection with sort of freight movement. And I remember having lots of discussions in some project about modelling as to whether, if a plumber was taking the boiler with them, was that a service trip or was it a freight trip, or split halfway between the two things? Anyway, on this receiving, I mean, it's way wider than just a question of people, of homes, because if you think about buildings that are developed, retail spaces and also offices in particular, they're not very well designed in many cases for deliveries. And why would you want to design for this if you're trying to maximize the square meters of space for commercial reasons? So I think rules or regulations about this are important in terms of the design of buildings and about ensuring that people do allocate space for these activities. So I would say that having the being willing to think about regulation is necessary in this case, and that would be important.
Thanks, Mike. Claire, did I see you tentatively, and then Maggie coming back on this? Some wishes we might be able to grant.
Yeah, my point's quite quick, but I think it was about that point about kind of the problems and the best practice and kind of the rest of the stuff not really kind of getting so much attention. And I think one of the things I remember having a conversation with one of our members about is there's often funding to go first with something, and it relates to this idea of like things still being in trial status, that you might get funding to trial something, but actually once you've got past that, there isn't necessarily the funding there to support schemes. But obviously the costs of maybe shifting to zero emission vehicles are still much higher than conventional vehicles. So yeah, we often get funding for these like trials and this best practice, but actually what comes next is really tricky.
So scaling is perhaps your real concern. I know that's true in the decarbonisation space. Maggie?
Yeah, so I mean, I reflect on a couple of things. I think first is that I understand that people haven't got a lot of knowledge and it is a really complicated sector. I've been in it 20 years and I learn something new every day. But I don't think we are, immune from asking the question. So, Claire's reports, and, do read it if you haven't, because it's really good. But it has this beautiful example in it of a local body who was really frustrated because they'd put down some beautiful urban space paving and it got broken up by HGVs. And so HGVs were nasty and should be banned or whatever. That doesn't say that last bit, that's my inference. But, if there were shops down that road, what did we think was going to happen when we put down the urban paving? How did we think the shops were going to be fulfilled? And even if we don't understand freight and logistics, can we ask the question? So Transport for New Homes is a great organisation, but why in their report have they not asked the question, how would we like our 15-minute neighbourhood or our new housing development to be serviced? Why isn't that part of the integral thinking? And my final plea is, I absolutely understand there is a place in some deliveries, in some locations, for cargo bikes. I'm not anti-cargo bike. Because if you have a 44-ton lorry full, you will need somewhere between 250 and 300 cargo bikes to move the equivalent. And if they're coming into central London from Barking, which is 40 miles, that's 250 or 300 people capable of cycling 100 kilograms for 40 miles, and they'll do one round trip a day. So the price of your goods will quadruple by the time you've done that. And if I bring a train full of aggregates into an urban space, that's 2,000 tons. So cargo bikes are great for some parts of the solution. But as Michael says, we need inner urban warehousing to fulfill them. That inner urban warehousing is probably going to have an HGV coming into it. So if we don't want HGV, we can't have the warehouse. So we have to just think, where is the right place for this? And there are plenty of places where it is the right place. But if it is the right place, what is the infrastructure behind it? And how are we putting that into the planning system? Because otherwise we're ending up in this really polarized debate. And I can see it in the questions. E-cargo bikes is the most predominant thing in those questions. So we just need to think a bit wider.
Yeah, I take your point very seriously. I'm sort of silently inside smiling because of the number of things I've seen on Twitter where someone says, well, you'll never be able to take a fridge home on a cargo bike. And then somebody puts an image up of a fridge on a cargo bike, or 20 kegs of beer going to a brewery being cycled by someone. And of course those are kind of peripheral illustrations of some of what's possible, but as you rightly say, Maggie, there's a much bigger picture. Andrew, I'll maybe sort of push over a question to you, but in doing so, picking a couple of threads together, Mike referred to regulation, and it seems self-evident there are rational actors involved in the business of goods movement, each with their own objectives. And Roger Witt in the audience essentially highlights the distinction between cooperation and competition. You know, as rational actors, there are certain things where, to fulfil my own goals, I might be well placed to cooperate in terms of the decarbonisation agenda, but in other respects, perhaps the competition for the curbside, you know, I'm up against you. And we come right back to Maggie's point about freight doesn't vote. Since freight doesn't vote, but perhaps it's starting to, is regulation mostly of interest, or rather the hand of government mostly of interest when votes are at stake? So I just wonder, you mentioned, Andrew, your connection between firms up through to policymakers. Do you sense there is appetite for more regulation to help sort of square this circle of competition and cooperation?
I think to some extent operators will work together if there's a mutual benefit. There have been examples where operators have collaborated to do stuff, and equally, as Michael highlighted, things like freight quality partnerships are a good way of bringing certain operators together to talk about issues. Obviously, there is competition in there as well, and it's about getting that balance right. I think we've talked a lot about how freight works, and I think we've got to be careful in going back on towards regulation on that, because we do have something that 99% of the time delivers what it needs to do when it does it. And to some extent, you can see that deregulation has brought around a lot of that competitive advantage. I think where you've got to think carefully is around where there are particular pressures, so like for instance in urban areas. How do you get operators to work together? Is that through more localized regulations or constraints? But again, it comes back to looking at the system as a whole and the fact that different bits fit together. So, okay, you want to limit vehicles going into an urban area to say 3.5 ton trucks, fine. But then that has a knock-on impact back up the supply chain, and ultimately, as Maggie said, in the cost of delivery. So it's about that joined up thinking, about trying to find areas where you can regulate to try and make things better, but also finding other areas where actually it's better to leave things be and informally encourage collaboration. Obviously within the broader spirit of sort of competition rules.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think regulation is very difficult. It always creates lots of arguments about this because, and I'm not thinking here so much about regulation on market access or necessarily entry. Well, there are regulations on entry to the profession, obviously, but I'm thinking more about how we make how we have rules about the design of things, and we can have rules about the design of the truck, but we should also have rules about the design of the curbside, perhaps, because we had the example that Maggie quoted from Claire's report where the curb design doesn't work in that setting, and yet there are plenty of examples of good ways to design for that, and we should perhaps not necessarily have a specific regulation, you must do this, but we should have some standard that should be met for that, just as we would expect there to be a certain number of parking spaces in a new development, and we should expect a certain number of loading spaces perhaps in a development, and we should take the loading aspect seriously. And I think that this question of regulation, I just don't think we're going to get there very fast if all we say is it would be good if somebody could do something that was a bit better than it is at the moment. I just get the feeling it's like a bit vague.
I'll perhaps segue from that to you, Daniela, because I'm not sure whether you used the term, but very much part of what you were speaking to in your earlier remarks was demand management. You highlighted 25% of products returned, and I think whether it was you or someone else had referred to, I think it was you, about the opportunities for consolidation. And whilst we can say it works in inverted commas as a system of goods movement, the externalities of it working are a separate question. And if we're creating significant inefficiencies, partly because we're meeting market demand for just-in-time, instant gratification, only through intervening in the market and considering perhaps pricing signals as one example, can we start to reshape some of the innovation to get wider benefits in terms of those high level goals that Claire referred to in terms of outcomes. So sorry, I've rambled a bit there, but I wonder, Daniela, whether you have any further views or optimism about what could happen with demand management and how effective that could be.
I think buying now is very easy, is cheap, convenient, especially online shopping. We have plenty of inputs from different websites and social media, so it's easy to buy anything you want. If you don't like it, you can return it for free. And I think all these policies established by retailers don't help and make it feel convenient for someone to buy something more, some extra products they might not need really. So I think there would be, rather than managing the demand, is changing how we, rethinking how we, I wouldn't say, so I think it can be partially covered by regulations, I would say from central government rather than local governments. So how can we ask retailers to help the system to reduce these externalities? And I mentioned also consumption reduction. If it wasn't very popular among councillors when I mentioned consumption reduction, actually within one of my projects, actually they told me, how can we ask people to buy less? That wouldn't work. They wouldn't be happy. And okay, that's fine, but we don't have to tell them they have to buy less. We can show them why they should buy less. And I think they will be smart enough to understand why they should buy less. So I think rethinking the way we sell products and rethinking how the way we buy products might help in reducing externalities overall, like congestion and air pollution, carbon emissions in general. So I think education and communication is quite a strong tool that we can use. That is because all the plans and strategies mainly focus on technologies and innovation, but mainly related to new technologies or cleaner technologies. There is very little about behavior change or organizational change, and also collaborative schemes. Yes, it's true. There are some examples that show they work, but we should also consider how smaller operators, so depending on the size of the company, some operators might have some advantages. So bigger operators might gain advantages if they join a collaborative scheme, and smaller operators might be actually kicked off the bigger group, plenty of sharks. So I think it's how we rethink the system to make it more environmentally and social friendly, to actually make freight more sustainable overall.
Yeah, it's fascinating that we've not touched a great deal directly on behaviour change of the consumer, but and you didn't quite go as far as to say a new degrowth economy, but actually for many people that's becoming quite an enticing, and for others a very threatening prospect of fundamental system change. Go Daniela.
Just a little thing, because you mentioned also consolidation, right? Mm-hmm. So from a series of different logistics operators, I know that logistics operators already consolidate at a very efficient level within their own firms. So it's actually about consolidation schemes. It's actually a matter of understanding, do they work? Are we sure we can consolidate more the freight, the movements that are already consolidated at the firm based? So I think consolidation is good for those deliveries that are hard to consolidate, like same day or next day. But I think they might be challenging to consolidate anyway if we use a consolidation scheme. Yeah, because they need to get to the destination point very quick, so they're very hard to manage and consolidate.
I can see Claire and Maggie, but I can also, and Andrew, I can also see the clock. You'd be amazed to know we've only got 15 minutes left in this fantastic conversation. So just for the purposes of time management, what I'll do if I can is kind of pass the mic to each of you for a couple of minutes, so you can bring in other points you want to raise, which might be the reasons for your hands being up, or if you want to dig back into the questions that we had right at the outset of kicking off this event. So Claire, if I can start with you, and then Andrew, I'll come to you, and Maggie to follow.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on that point around kind of behaviour change. And I think I was thinking about the kind of avoid, shift, improve framework that we often use when we're thinking about personal travel behaviour, but it's actually useful in thinking about behaviour change within freight as well. So what things can we avoid? And there's that kind of consuming less, but also I think it was Andrew mentioned about waste, and the fact that kind of waste generation is a big part of our freight. And so how can we reduce waste to reduce the kind of number of trips we need for kind of waste collection? And then we think about the shifting elements. So, using more sustainable options where we can, and improving options where there isn't an option to shift to those. So kind of maybe using greener vehicles. I think there's something around kind of consumer choice. So at the moment, you order something online, usually, next day delivery is kind of just standard, or there's a standard option. But I wonder if there's something around kind of creating more options and different price points for those options. So, say you actually do need something next day, you're paying a little bit of a premium for it. There's a kind of standard option, which is, a few days, but actually maybe you get a little bit of a discount if you say, oh, actually, I don't need this for a couple of weeks, and it can just come actually in the most efficient way. And maybe there's also options around kind of incentivizing greener delivery options for those who want to pay something to have it delivered by a cargo bike, if that's an option as well. So I wonder if there's something around kind of incentivizing more options for consumers to choose like how they want to receive their deliveries. And then just a little reflection on the consolidation point, which I think is really interesting. And I agree with Daniela's point that actually logistics operators are already consolidating their deliveries to a great degree. I think where it becomes really interesting is when we think about organisations and how they might change, again, their kind of behaviour to make their logistics operations more efficient. So in our report, we've got a really interesting example of a pilot project that Guy's and St Thomas Hospital are doing in London, where they've done a number of things to kind of try and improve their deliveries and logistics, including establishing a consolidation hub at Dartford to try and reduce the number of truck movements coming into the hospitals in central London, which is really effective. And they've now added an additional aspect to that, where they're having the deliveries made by riverboat on the Thames. So the deliveries have been consolidated at Dartford, brought up the Thames to like the closest kind of riverboat to stop, and then the last mile bit is being made by e-cargo bikes. So it really is that kind of full sustainable journey. So I mean, that's just one example, but where organisations can implement some of these consolidation options at an organisational level, I think that's a really interesting dimension.
Thanks, Claire. And I think just as I pass the baton to Andrew, what you've illustrated very well is that actually it's an incredibly innovative part of the transport sector, and in one sense that's hugely encouraging, because if we can offer new incentives and steers to the sector, it's probably going to respond very well and effectively, one could imagine. Andrew.
Yeah, just picking up again on, I suppose, the demand side of things and also consolidation. I think we've always got to remember that any demand for transport is derived demand. So actually, if we want to change a lot of practices, it's not regulation on logistics is what you need, it's regulation on other areas that will then have a knock-on impact into logistics. So like say, how do we change consumer behaviours? So should we outlaw free returns, for example, or free next day delivery? Which, yes, that has logistics implications, but it's not actually a logistics regulation as such. And then on consolidation, I mean, obviously there's various examples of good practice, but the construction industry is probably one to particularly highlight, where you do, rather than have one customer, you've got multiple suppliers that then go into a single location. Again, for lots of examples. I know Mike's done work, I think, very much in that sort of area previously. And that's one example where a sector has made big improvements. Again, and the gains aren't just about logistics efficiency, it's also around things like safety on site as well, by having fewer vehicles passing through. So there are sectors and examples out there. It's just thinking about how you can translate that across into other parts of the industry. So I think I'll leave it there for time.
Brilliant, thanks Andrew. I'll pass the baton to Maggie.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was sort of coming in on a similar point to Andrew, which is don't use, the freight industry to try and regulate everything else in the economy. We just turn up and drive the trucks or pull the trains in effect. I think the other thing just to reflect is, the economy does matter. So we are now staring in the face of a recession. Volume over the key is already down. The forecasts for the autumn are down. When we have recessions, businesses fold, people lose their jobs, and it's an unpleasant time. So when we're talking about reducing demand, doing less, whilst we can all understand the environmental reasons for why that is a good thing, we also have to navigate the economic impact of that and on the individual people who are affected by that. So if you are expecting a freight company to put its hand up and say, I tell you what, I've had a great idea to save the planet, I'm just going to go bankrupt, that's probably not going to happen. So we have to be really mindful of that. And the other bit we have to be really mindful of is on consumer price, because part of the cost of living crisis at the moment has happened because of the spike in road driver costs caused by the loss of driver market on the back of Brexit. And it is probably a good thing that HGV drivers are being paid more. As you said at the opening, it's not always a great job. So we're not against that, but that it will wash through into what we pay. And in the face of a cost of living crisis and a recession, we have to know that we're prepared to accept that. And when we consolidate, we handle the goods more, it puts the prices up. When we restrict operating hours, require more expensive vehicles, that all comes together. And maybe that's the price we have to pay to get the carbon saving that we want. But we have to go into it with our eyes open and understand that we will have to navigate those redundancies, those price increases, and that different economic pattern.
Great, thanks, Maggie. Daniel, just before I come to you, I'll bring Mike in and then pass across to you before we start to have a last round of your sort of closing takeaways. Mike.
No, I think we could have an interesting discussion, very much focused about rules and regulation and the planning system and so on. And so that would be something that we've touched on, but there's a lot of different things that one could sort of talk about in that. I think it's very difficult to expect transport operators to always be the ones to make the first move, and I think this is a point that's been made here. So I would just echo that just they often have to do what their customers have asked them to do, and therefore it's about understanding that the stakeholders are wider than the transport industry, that it is about the receivers and even about other organizations, which I've been working with someone, and she finished her PhD last December, and she sort of identified a group of organizations in the city that she called influencers. And these were organizations like business improvement districts, for example, and the property owners themselves who want to maximize, in a sense, maximize the use of their buildings for all kinds of different purposes, one of which requires things to be delivered. And she did some work to show that these influencers could also be important in creating change, which is what I think we've been all talking about, how to create change. And so I think there's a sort of a whole lot of things that we could discuss on that side of it, and we won't have time to do that today. So I hope maybe you'll have another freight thing at another point in the future. I just thought one thing that sort of made me think, because it came right in the first question, but not in quite the same way, was about the just-in-time question. And I was thinking about time as just as time as an important thing. And I think there's all kinds of issues around time which are interesting here. As Maggie said, this is going to be a very difficult time at which to make some of these kind of decisions, but we seem very good at postponing the point at which we make some of these decisions as a society, and that means that we probably are going to have to make difficult decisions at a time that's not the best time to make them, I suspect, and it will be interesting to see how that can be managed in some ways. And then in terms of time, I think this perhaps applies to urban areas, but I'd be quite interested. Probably we won't get to this today, but for instance, such a lot of freight activity actually takes place in just maybe half of the day, effectively. So most of the deliveries take place from 6, 7 in the morning until sometime in the late afternoon, early evening, and this peakiness in the nature of delivery patterns obviously means that there are all kinds of issues about capacity and utilization. And when you talk then about shifting to the off-peak times, of course that raises questions about noise, about intrusive behavior and so on. But surely with technology, we'll be able to find some solutions to these things. And I think if we were to look at this in 20 years' time, people will sort of say, do you know, they were a funny lot in that period that 20 years ago. Do you know they used to do nearly everything when it was daylight, and they didn't need daylight because they actually had other ways of dealing with this. But so I think time and how we use the time is sort of an important question that we could spend a little bit, we could think about a little bit more.
Okay, thanks, Mike. More and more food for thought, which we won't be able to digest today, unfortunately. Daniela.
Yeah, very quickly to pick up on Maggie's point on reduction of consumption. So about 25% of products bought online in the UK are returned, and this is, of course, free return policies are responsible for this, because you buy something you don't need, you realize it when it's home, and you return it because it's free. So I'm not suggesting we should ask freight companies not to sell their products. I'm suggesting we should inform in some way people about how much impactful their decisions are, and therefore to think twice before they buy something that is not needed. Also because it represents a high cost for retailers to get it back on the return journey. And in the case of global supply chains, these products don't even go back to factory, they become waste. So it's getting a bigger problem growing if we don't really act on informing people and understanding how to design pricing schemes to penalize these unsustainable deliveries, in my opinion, at least. Okay, now I've got a 4-minute dash to the finish, so I'm going to be very ambitious and give you each a one-liner, but it will need to be that. I know it's almost impossible, but is there a takeaway for each of you that either you're taking back to your role or that you really would like the audience to have indelibly marked in their minds in going back to their roles? Who am I going to put on the spot first? Maggie, are you happy to have a go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the takeaway I'd like people to get, from this is if they're doing some transport planning, what would you like to see happen? How do you want that shop fulfilled? If you don't like the HGV, what do you think is going to happen? And just ask the question, actually, because if you don't think about it, you won't get a different answer. Great. Thanks, Maggie. Andrew?
I think probably what I'd like to highlight is that there's a lot going on within the sector to try and do things, but ultimately it is driven by wider demand. There's only so much the industry can do without working with stakeholders across the sector, not so retailers, manufacturers, and policymakers and planners too.
Okay, great. Daniela, and then Mike and Claire.
Yeah, for me, a question as well. So how can we rethink, redesign our cities to accommodate these changing needs of a changing society as well? So how can we include freight into urban planning design, not only transport, also including spatial planning and transport planning and digital as well, so triple access planning.
Good, thanks Daniela. Mike?
Yeah, just I think going back to a point that I think Maggie made right at the very beginning, which I think is very important, that we recognize that when we're talking about freight, we're not discussing just e-commerce, we're not discussing just parcels, we're talking about a very diverse picture to do with construction, to do with longer distances, some of which ends or starts in the city, some of which goes through the city, and just at least recognize that complexity and then decide which part of that we want to deal with and how that relates to the rest of it. So let's not go away from this and only talk about it as if e-commerce is the biggest thing that's moving around in the system. It isn't, actually.
Thanks, Mike. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everyone else's sort of closing remarks, but I think that thing about, what outcomes do we want from our planning and thinking about, both what Maggie was saying about how, you get those goods in, but, thinking about the cities we want and how we design them to do, both the people movement and the goods movement. And I think, if I might say, thinking about the integration of the two dimensions, I think a really nice illustration of problems we get when we don't do that is when the government was trying to address the HGV driver shortage last year, they wrote to everyone with a HGV license to say, come and be a HGV driver, which included a lot of bus drivers who thought, you know what, I could go more money over there if I go and drive a HGV, and then had a knock-on impact for the passenger transport sector as well. So yeah, we really do need to think about the two together, so we don't have kind of these like competing demands on our systems.
Great, thank you, Claire. And a quick final word from me. I think I was hearing, particularly, I think Maggie's nervousness around degrowth and some good examples, but there's a sense of out of the frying pan into the fire, or better the devil you know. And I think inevitably there are really some quite significant tensions within and beyond the freight and logistics industry. And I find myself saying this so often now. We're of course dealing with wicked problems. These are not things we can solve, they're things we have to manage. And dealing with wicked problems requires cooperation and shared thinking. And I think today's session has, at least for me, and I hope for the audience, beautifully illustrated how bringing people together and different perspectives starts to help make that possible. And so my great encouragement as we look outwards from today is that the looming round of new local transport plans will really take the opportunity, with or without strong support from national government, to work cooperatively in order to make as best they can an opportunity to manage these challenges and opportunities. So with that, thank you ever so much to our panel and to our audience. I'll just briefly pass back to Brogan before, I wish I had a button at this point to press and you would all go hazy and be teleported back to the captain's deck with Andrew and I, but that sadly won't happen. But Brogan, do your best.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. It was a very interesting conversation. And I look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.